Hello and welcome to your lecture on food and medicine. This is a great chance mid-semester to think about what we've learned already regarding food regulation and food beliefs, and think about our learning goal of this week, which is how you think about food in relation to health. So when you think about eating eggs or MSG, as you'll be reading about this week, butter, red meat, salt, how do you think about these foods in terms of health? Do you think of them as a food or a drug? What's the difference? And we've discussed there's a lot of overlaps here. Can food, even if it's not a drug, still have curative properties? What if it's marketed as curative or preventative? As what? What does that mean for you? What have you been brought to believe about the curative or preventative properties of food? And what about food is marketed for the absence of a perceived or harmful substance? So you see a lot of foods labeled, we've talked about the GMO label, like non-GMO foods. And this, of course, is a great chance for me to give you an introduction into medical anthropology, which is very applicable when it comes to food. Because this idea of health and sickness, it varies across culture. And the things that cause health or sickness and the symptoms or traits that are associated with health and sickness. All of these things have been incredibly variable across space and time as humans have beliefs and ideas that they pass on to one another about health and sickness. So, three examples that I think are fascinating are body weight, menopause, and schizophrenia. So, we've discussed ideal body types and intersections between food and beauty. And as you know, there's variation in the ideal body type for beauty. Many societies that don't suffer from overnutrition like ours, fatness is often valued over thinness, especially for women. And so, especially around puberty, girls are encouraged to eat as much as possible because more fat means more attractiveness and thus better marriage prospects. But even things that we tend to take for granted as being relatively straightforward in the United States do vary cross-culturally. So menopause, for example, if you've talked to a woman over the age 50, she'll probably give you a standard list of menopausal symptoms, including hot flashes. But if you look around the world, symptoms of experiencing menopause do vary. In some places, people don't report experiencing hot flashes. And schizophrenia is the same way. So if you go to cultures high in the Himalayas or in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, people actually experience different symptoms for mental health disorders like schizophrenia, and there might even be different curative pathways as well. So all of these conceptualizations of health and sickness are in fact quite culture bound. And that brings up this concept of disease versus illness. So disease is how a biologist or a psychologist would describe the malfunctioning of the body. But as you know, if you've ever been diagnosed with a disease, it's not the strictly psychosocial experience of being sick. And these two things are different. So a lot of people become sick and really struggle to find a diagnosis or a name for the disease that they have because their experiences might not match up with the standard representation of what a medical professional might believe those symptoms are. So quite often these two do overlap, this experience of being sick, being ill, and the diagnosis of a disease. But the symptoms, sensations, disability, and how it affects your life of being ill is not always the same as the biomedical perspective of the bodily functions or the physiological process, or even the ways that you would respond to the causes of the disease. And this becomes especially apparent when we look back through history. And we realize that how illness is defined depends on the individual cultural and historical context. So we can think about the medicalization of illness symptoms that change them from the category of illness to disease. One of my favorite examples is this disease of the wandering womb. It started in ancient Greece, and it clung to European medical professions for well into the 1700s, if not still being diagnosed by some in the 1800s. And this was thought to contribute to female hysteria when your uterus would unattach itself from the rest of the body and go floating around inside the body, causing females to behave in unpredictable and therefore dangerous ways that need to be cured. And of course, this has been completely debunked. Your uterus never detaches and goes floating around, up into your head or your lungs or whatever. But a little bit more seriously is that some conditions that haven't previously been recognized as illness or disease can transition to disease through the medicalization process. And a great and rather unfortunate example is the concept of PTSD. So it was recognized as, there's been versions of quote unquote shell shock that became popularized after World War I, going back centuries. But whether it was called shell shock after World War I, or combat fatigue or battle fatigue syndrome after World War II, or now post-traumatic stress disorder, it's seen a progression of medicalization in how we conceptualize and treat soldiers coming back from traumatic experiences during warfare. Another interesting example is alcoholism. And kind of like the concept of shell shock, early in the 1900s, excessive alcohol consumption was viewed as a sign of weak character, and therefore not a disease, not an illness, not something that could be necessarily cured. But modernly, instead of calling someone a drunk, we would say they suffer from alcoholism. And it's recognized by health insurance companies and healthcare providers, who have begun to view addiction and alcoholism as a disease with corresponding treatments that can be prescribed. And so personal history, cultural context, and historical context can all intersect to define whether something is not a disease, just an illness, or diagnosed as disease. And we're going to come back to food in a second, but I do want to mention one other important concept of medical anthropology, and that is even if people are diagnosed with the same disease or experiencing the same symptoms of illness, the sick role, the social expectations of what you will do when sick vary with class, gender, age, employment, and lifestyle. So this is my daughter. When she was 1, she had the flu. Poor thing. She was so sick. But she is relatively fortunate enough that I could stay home with her. And she was very young, so I was not expecting her to go to work or to daycare while she was sick. And so her class and her age intersected to mean that she got this sick day. And she is set up. She's got her juice, she's got her snacks, her blankets. She was watching the first 20 minutes of Bambi on repeat. Life is good for her. But while I'm taking this picture, I also have the flu, and my sick role expectations were quite different when you're taking care of a very young child who's sick while you're very sick yourself. I was not set up. I was not able to curl up under the blanket with my juice and watch my favorite movie all day because I was taking care of her. So my age and employment status, and probably to some extent my gender, affected how she and I both experienced this sick day. A little bit more tongue-in-cheek, to talk about gender a bit more, if you can think about a genderized disease, one that comes to mind for students, the first one that's noticed by students is the man flu. I'm not saying men actually do get sicker. This is not a diagnosed representation. It's more of a cultural joke. There might be something to be said for the fact that testosterone acts as an immune suppressant. But it does seem to be this joking difference between spouses that even if the husband and a wife both get sick, the man is somehow expected to be able to take on the sick role more than the woman and be cared for. Absolutely no judgment here on whether this is actually occurring or it's just a cultural joke, but students have brought this up in the past. But we can think about other things like class, employment, and lifestyle, because these also interact with being sick, and people who are experiencing poverty usually work more physically demanding jobs, usually eat less healthy food, and therefore usually likely to experience more disease or get sicker, and are also less likely to seek medical care. And so it's very much a class or an income or employment status of asking whether you can afford to be sick. Can you actually take on this sick role? Or can you engage in the behaviors that prevent sickness? And this was acknowledged as early as the 1940s, where researchers found that the acknowledgement of illness was incredibly variable by income. So one responded as a result of this study and a lot of interviews about sickness and health and class and income. She described feeling so bad that she could just curl up and die, but she wasn't allowed to recognize herself as being sick because her family didn't have the money to visit a doctor and the kids needed someone to care for them. And she said, most of us can't be sick even when we need to be. And remember, this is from the 1940s, but I think this still rings true today. I mean, some people might have sufficient wealth to be sick or to take sick days more often or to take sick days for more mild symptoms or even seek medical treatment for minor ailments or elective surgeries that other people or elective procedures that others with less resources would not have access to. So I want you to keep these points in mind as we begin to discuss food as potentially curative and who can afford health-giving food or disease-preventing food and who can't. And oftentimes this also goes hand in hand with the time to shop and prepare those foods as well. Okay, so I think it's widely recognized in the U.S. that we do see food as curative or even preventative for health problems. And a lot of folks in the U.S., we have desires for these easily affordable solutions to our health problems. And eating a well-balanced diet, mostly plants, not too much, getting enough exercise, rest, and keeping stress low can seem like a luxury, this whole body experience of health-giving behaviors. It's much easier to imagine there's one thing you should eat or one thing you shouldn't eat that will give you access to that healthy lifestyle that's otherwise unachievable. And so there's always these ads, you see them on the internet, I'm sure you have all the time, gut doctor says, I beg Americans to throw out this vegetable now. As far as I can tell from this picture, this person is chopping lotus root. I don't know how many households in the US use and cook with lotus root. But you might have seen things like, doctors don't have any medicine for my weight loss. Then my grandma gave me her secret drink and I lost 800 pounds in just 6 months. There's just this human desire for an easy fix. And maybe it's something that science hasn't even recognized yet. And a lot of that is sought in foods. And we're going to talk about food fraud and we're going to talk about evaluating food data. But I do have to say, some medicines do come from food, like penicillin, mold, aspirin, willow bark. You could eat these things and get very, very small doses of these compounds that do have some curative properties. So let's go back and start a discussion of food as curative with our old friend garlic. As you remember from reading in 8 Flavors, that although now the average American consumes about 2 pounds of garlic per year, garlic was not really thought of as a dietary ingredient. Through most of written history, it was more thought of as a curative herb, something with medicinal properties. Now, it does produce allicin, which can be a powerful antioxidant when it's cut or crushed. But as you read in 8 Flavors, you know that the curative properties of garlic go far beyond what the plant is probably capable of. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle says garlic is said to be a sovereign remedy for gout, but there's no remedy for garlic. 8 Flavors also discusses an excellent remedy for earache. Take 3 or 4 roasted garlics, mash them up while hot, add a tablespoon of sweet oil and as much honey and laudanum. Press it out and drop it into the ear occasionally. Now, it's probably not the garlic in this compound that is curing the earache. Laudanum is a dilute form of opium, and so it's probably the fact that you're putting an opiate in your ear that's curing your earache. But nevertheless, as I'll show you in a few slides, there's an ongoing discussion about what the curative properties of garlic are. And it takes us back through most of human history, and even continuing today, the concept of using botanical substances for healing. And in anthropology, this is referred to as ethnobotany. This cultural knowledge of the curative properties of plant material and how to use them. And a lot of the breakthroughs in modern medicine have been using cultural knowledge of plants to seek out new remedies for substances like penicillin, where trace amounts can be found in the natural world and then concentrated and used to cure disease. One great example of this is the recognition of ibogaine, which is used by the Bwiti of Gabon. Here's a picture of the plant. And the Bwiti would chew the root or brew tea from the plant and give it to either ill people to cure or to health professionals among the Bwiti to reveal the true antidote for the disease through visions. And in the 1960s, a man named Howard Lotsof visited the Bwiti and realized that the substance from the ibogaine plant could combat heroin and opiate addiction, or at least alleviate the painful and exhausting withdrawal symptoms from heroin and opiate addiction. It's still illegal in the US, but researchers are looking into synthesizing it as an anti-addiction medicine. And this type of knowledge about the botanical properties and use of plants is usually called traditional ecological knowledge. So this knowledge about the local ecology that is passed down through generations and provides, positive returns to individuals. And traditional ecological knowledge has been shown to improve nutrition, health, response to climate change, pest infestations, weather shocks, to manage natural resources, select cultivars, and cure disease. So we're going to talk about honey again throughout the class. I studied wild honey collecting with an indigenous tribe in South India as part of my traineeship. And these guys go out and collect wild forest honey because it's thought to be incredibly curative. Some times used in a home remedy, like making a tea with lemon and honey to cure sore throat and cough. But like garlic, honey also has some recognized antibacterial properties. It can kill salmonella and staph. It's great to put on a cut or an open wound, not a burn, because it excludes water and suppresses bacterial growth. It's also been used as a cough suppressant and sore throat coat. But there's something kind of mysteriously attributed to forest honey that creates this big desire among urban dwellers to consume forest honey to cure all sorts of ills from, depression to cancer. And it sounds a lot like garlic. Garlic studies are not only ongoing, but they're increasing for the health-giving properties of consuming garlic. Now, in a recent double-blind study, patients who took a daily garlic capsule developed colds 2/3 less often than those who swallowed a placebo and also recovered a day faster when they did get sick. But a lot of the curative properties of garlic fall into the might category. Okay, so garlic might help lower blood pressure. In some contexts or with some people, it looks like it helped lower blood pressure or control blood sugar. It might reduce the risk of gastric and colon cancer, might prevent arteries from hardening and catching common colds. But there's no certainty here, and there's a lot of nuances to be worked out. And also some complications. So, for example, there might be some interaction with anticoagulant medicines as well. So while garlic certainly has antimicrobial properties like black pepper and curry spices and honey, so it might be good for things like burns and allergies. it might not be good for some things like burns and allergies, and especially halitosis or breath. There's just a lot that we don't know through science yet. So, for example, one of the curative properties is also that it wards off vampires, and this would be very hard to test. If you've met a vampire, let me know. And that's the problem with a lot of the curative properties of food, is it's just hard to test. So a great example of this is for the superfood industry. If you can put the superfood label on something like pomegranate juice or the acai berry, this has created a billion-dollar global industry. Superfoods are it's a marketing term applied to food that's assumed to confer a health benefit. Okay, so usually these are something locally exotic, usually a fruit, but also can be a grain. So there's also a term called super grains. And the term superfood is not commonly used by medical experts like dietitians and nutrition scientists, and many of whom dispute that these foods labeled superfoods have the health benefits claimed by their advocates. Now remember, this is a marketing term. And in fact, there's not a lot of regulation for the use of this term superfood in the US. It's kind of like the label all natural. It's ill-defined and therefore ill-regulated. In 2007, the European Union prohibited the use of this word superfood on labels or marketing products as superfood because they were, unless there is some specific authorized health claim supported by credible scientific research. So the superfood label is much less prevalent in the European Union as being more strongly regulated and dependent on credible scientific research. Now, of course, like with the ibogaine plant or honey and garlic, there might be a kernel of truth to the curative properties of superfoods. So some diseases that result from specific nutrient deficiency, like scurvy, vitamin C deficiency, and anemia, iron deficiency, can be solved by eating these nutrient-dense diets. And so the huckleberry was thought at one point it was a superfood as European sailors landed on the western coast of the United States after long sea voyages. They ate local huckleberries and everyone got better. And miraculously, huckleberries were thought of as a superfood. And I think that's why it's very difficult to find a lot of credible scientific research to claim these are superfoods, because they might be superfoods to some folks with specific nutrient deficiencies, but for others do nothing if you don't already have that nutrient deficiency. So just be wary of the superfood label. And if you can, look for credible scientific research and the context of which those superfoods might confer benefits. But do know that it's a very loosely regulated label in the United States, mostly used for marketing purposes. And we've talked about some of these superfoods elsewhere through the class and how a lot of times they're just acting as placebos. So we discussed nutmeg and the trade with the Spice Islands and Indonesia, and how it was so highly sought after as a cure for plague. And it's been repeatedly found that nutmeg does not actually cure the plague, nor does water cure rheumatism, as was discussed in the guest lecture. And currently, a lot of superfoods are being touted as treating cancer or preventing cancer. And many of these diet-based cancer treatments do lack data for effectiveness. But like we said, with the nutrient deficiencies that are cured by eating foods high in vitamin C or high in iron, there might be an association between diet and well-being, this difference between disease and illness. If you're feeling unwell and you eat a specific diet and it makes you feel better, even though it might be hard to find scientific research, maybe you think about your disease from the concept of illness instead. But again, be aware that many things are marketed to get you to buy them, and may not have broad-based scientific research to back up their curative properties. And as I said, humans, we're susceptible for easy fixes to bigger problems. And a lot of the diet-based disease in the US today is part of much bigger problems other than just eating or not eating lotus root or manuka honey, for example. And a lot of food fraud is committed in the search of superfoods. So food fraud is defined as foods that are adulterated or not composing only the ingredients either listed on the label or described in the description of the food. Food fraud is usually associated with foods with long supply chains and with high demand foods. And my favorite example of food fraud is manuka honey. So manuka honey is thought to have supposedly a wide range of health benefits, and it's worth a lot of money. But I can tell you that economists know that New Zealand bees only make 15 tons of manuka honey each year. But England, or the UK, only imports 18,000. The UK alone imports 18,000 tons of it. So the UK is importing more manuka honey than is produced, and that's not including imports to the US or other countries. So that means that much of the manuka honey that's on the market is necessarily fraudulent. And there's a variety of ways to create fraudulent manuka honey, so maybe mixing it with other types of honey to stretch the manuka honey further, or mixing it with sugar water to dilute the manuka honey. And then, there's lots of legal questions like how much percentage of the honey in this jar has to be real manuka honey for it to be marketed as real manuka honey. And these are great conversations that have been had throughout history. If you want to do a little side research, peanut butter is a great example of this. And the honey collectors that I was working with in India, they knew this too, and they watered down their honey with sugar water so that they could sell more of the forest honey and reap the reward. There's been a lot of types of chemical analysis invented to check whether the sucrose in honey is actually honey or other types of sugar. You can look for the C4 carbon structures from trace amounts of pollen in the honey to see if the plants that they're visiting are visited by bees that make manuka honey. There's a lot of different ways to check, but honestly, the producers of manuka honey, when prices are so high, have a real financial incentive to fool you. And with 40,000 products on supermarket shelves in the US, there's no way to test every product for food fraud. And obviously, food safety takes precedence. So even if people are mixing manuka honey with other types of honey, if it's not making people sick, there's not a huge incentive for the FDA to track down the honey fraudsters. So authenticity of products can often take the backseat to safety. So even if manuka honey has real curative properties, people who are buying branded manuka honey off the shelves might not actually be consuming manuka honey or a large percentage of manuka honey in that bottle. And so it's an interesting logical connection between whether the substance is actually curative, in what density, and people who are seeking out that food or the substance in that food are actually consuming it, even if they're buying food marketed as such. Now, I say all this not to make you feel so disenfranchised and powerless in your world, but merely to make you aware of the fact that these things happen in an industrialized food production system that we are dependent on to feed people. Which brings me to the final disease that I wanted to talk about today that is actually cured by food. And I suppose it's not really labeled a disease, but definitely a health concern, and that is hunger. So how would you conceive of hunger as a disease? It's thought of as affecting 1 in 5 kids in America are at least at risk. 1 in 5 kids are at risk of hunger in America, and this year I think has made it all the more precarious. And if kids don't get access to enough calories or proper nutrition, this can affect their development and their entire future lives. And this is a great chance for anthropology to play a role in thinking about, is hunger a disease? How would you prescribe food to cure hunger? How can you use these internal sensations, these symptoms of illness, that you're hungry to help us choose health-giving food? And furthermore, when non-nutritious calories are cheaper than nutritious calories, how do things like class and gender and employment and age play a role in who gets access not just to calories, but to health-giving foods? Okay, so we've covered a lot today. We actually have a class on medical anthropology in the anthropology department if you are interested in some of these topics. As an anthropologist myself, I really like these broad-minded conceptualizations of what is illness, what is a disease, how do people experience them, and how would you connect something like food to these categorizations, and how do you connect it to broader cultural patterns like gender and age and employment, to think about big problems like hunger in the US. Now, at this point, normally in an in-person class, we'd have you go into small groups and to talk about and to start to think through some of these concepts. So before you end the lecture today, I encourage you to pause and just think about some of these questions. Think about food as medicine, um, and, and being part of this conversation about what is disease and how we should treat it. Have you come across or explored or talked to other people about foods that can confer health? Or special diets perhaps that would help to cure illness, perhaps foods that cause illness. What conditions do these occur under? And more importantly, think about, how do you know this information? Is it this personal experience of illness? Is there some sort of biomedical research about this food and disease? Is it part of a marketing pamphlet on Manuka honey, for example, or a website? So for me, this is the most critical component of the lecture, is where does this knowledge come from? How do you know it? Not saying you necessarily have to refer to the biomedical literature, but to even just know how you know this information is really useful. Okay, so that's all for today. I hope you enjoy the other activities this week, and I will see you next time.